All right, in this next video, we're going to get into moving this object around. So again, there's going to be a lot of different keyboard shortcuts. Be sure to pause this as you need to. All right, so first, objects that have a gold line around them are selected. To select an object, you right-click on it. So go ahead and right-click on the different objects in the scene to select them. To select multiple objects, you can shift select them. And notice that the most recent object selected is light gold, and the other selected objects are now sort of a reddish gold. So that's important because later on, whatever the last most selected object will affect certain changes. So if you want to select or deselect everything, you can hit A. So A on your keyboard will select or deselect everything. Go ahead and select that gold cube again. If you want to delete an object, you hit X. So it's not actually delete on your keyboard, it's X, as in you want to exit out. So go ahead and hit X, and it'll say, do you want to delete it? Now, if you don't have anything selected and you hit X, it's going to try to delete something and nothing really happens. So make sure you have an object selected. Go ahead and select the cube, hit X, and let's go ahead and say, yes, let's delete it. Now, Shift A will add an object to the screen, but where that object is depends on this 3D cursor. So this guy right here, if I box select around it, you can't really see that, but is your 3D cursor. It's a virtual object in the scene, and you can position it in 3 different views in space by using those keyboard shortcut keys to toggle around to your front view, your top view, your side view. The other way you can position that is by going to Shift S, and you can say cursor to center. That's the center of this grid. So Shift S will put the cursor to the center. I'll toggle around to a different view. You can see that cursor stays in the middle. And then I'll do Shift A to add a new object to the scene. So Shift A is one of those keyboard shortcuts you're going to have to remember. Shift A. You can see that there's a whole bunch of different things we can add. For this first module, we're only going to be working with mesh primitives. So don't worry about these other guys. We'll get to them later. So go ahead and add back a cube. And there's a cube at the center of our screen. If I click someplace else in space and do Shift A and add a cube, it'll add a cube to that spot. So you can have multiple objects in a scene this way. Let's go ahead and delete this other cube, X, to delete it. All right, so we've got our cube. I'm checking my lecture notes because there's a lot of things we're going to be doing. If you want to undo an action, you can do Control Z to undo it. You can do Control Z again to redo it or continue to undo. Shift Control Z to redo it. Command Z also works on Macs. In older versions of Blender it didn't, so I'm sort of used to using Control Z. So if I say Control Z, that's why. But the Mac keyboard shortcuts also work. Let's see. Next, if you want to duplicate an object, you can do Shift D to duplicate a selected object. As soon as you hit Shift D, you have an object sort of stuck to your mouse. You don't need to click anything. Once you get your object where you want, then right-click and it'll put it down that place. So let's go ahead and practice that. Shift D to duplicate that cube, and then right-click to put it down. Let's go ahead and delete those cubes. Again, left-click to select it, X to delete it. All right, you guys are doing great. I can totally see it in my mind. Let's go ahead and add a few more objects. Just to practice, Shift A, and then add a cube or a plane. Now, if you have multiple objects and you want to select them at once, we've already done the Shift select, so you're Shift right-clicking. But the other way to select a bunch of objects is to use the box marquee. This will get really handy when we get into mesh modeling. So that make the box marquee, you hit B on your keyboard, and you get these crosshairs, and they just follow along with your mouse. Once you right or left click and drag, it'll draw a box over a certain number of objects, and whatever objects it overlaps with, it'll select them. So I'll go ahead and delete those 2 objects. And you can use that box marquee to select everything in your scene or just select a few things, and then hit A to deselect. All right. Now, we're getting on to the next page in lecture notes, actually, so that's sort of exciting. All right, so go ahead and right-click on your cube. Now we're going to get into moving these objects around, which is where Blender starts getting really powerful. So in the last video I mentioned we have the red x-axis, the green y-axis, and the blue z-axis. Down here in the lower left-hand corner, there's a little widget that reminds you what side you're looking at. So as we toggle around our scene, we can see that this little axis changes as well. This is what's called a global orientation, and you can see that it's set to global right here. We're going to leave it in global almost the entire semester. We'll learn about these other transform orientations later on, but to keep things simple, it's helpful to always have up and down Z and left and right being X and Y. Now, the other thing you'll see next to global is that there's a couple different widgets, and if we hover over them, it tells you what these different objects are. This is a really handy feature in Blender. So it says use the 3D manipulator widget for controlling transformations. If we scroll over this next one, it says transform manipulators rotate. So we'll learn about all those guys. But while keyboard shortcuts are really helpful, sometimes it's just as easy to grab objects in the scene and move them. So if I click and drag on this red arrow, you can see that it moves this object only in the x-axis, similar to the green arrow. So go ahead and practice this, pause the video as you need to, and that arrow. Now, if I click and drag with my right button in the middle, you'll notice that before we've been able to click and drag this cube. So if you right click and drag, you'll be able to move this middle cube. And actually, once you start clicking and dragging, you can let go of that right click button and it'll just stick to your mouse. Then when you want to put it down somewhere, you left click. So let's practice that again. You right click and drag, and then you can let go of that button and then left click to put it down. All right, so very handy. That's the transform manipulator. So transform just means position change. Just remember that. The next manipulator is the rotate. So if we click on that, you can see that it changes how that manipulator appears around the object. And it's the same thing. If I left click and drag around the green line, it rotates it around the y-axis. The red rotates around the x-axis. And the blue rotates around the z-axis. And you can see that my cube is all different directions now. If I go back to my transform manipulator, keep in mind that it's using the global orientation. So it's not relative to the cube, it's relative to the entire scene. And so being able to rotate things is handy. And then if you click and drag, whoops, let me see if I can get it. If you just click and drag anywhere, it'll just toggle it around any which way. All right. So next is the scale transform manipulator. If we go to the scale transform manipulator, it'll scale it along that x-axis. Now this is a little weird looking, so I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this cube. I'm going to recenter my 3D cursor, Shift S, cursor to center, Shift A to make a new cube. And now when I transform them, you can see it looks a little bit more regular. So as your objects get rotated around, because it's scaling relative to the scene, it can get kind of deformed. So if I want to make this a sort of wall, I can scale in that Y and then scale up the blue axis. Now it's important to notice that object's rotation point and scaling point is the middle of the object. So if you can see, there's a little gold dot in the middle of the object. Right now it's in the middle of my 3D cursor. If I left click to get my 3D cursor out of the way, it's still going to scale and rotate based off of that middle pivot point. So just be aware of where your gold middle pivot point is, because later on in the semester we're actually going to be changing that. Now the other thing to be careful with scaling is to make sure that you don't scale so far that you get into an inverted object or a negative object. So again, if I click and drag, oops, let me any which way in that middle form, it'll just scale it willy-nilly. If you pull up the transform shelf, it gives you all kinds of information about this object. So it tells us that our location is just slightly off center. That's okay. It tells us that our object isn't rotated at all, and it gives us lots of information about the scale. Now watch what happens though if I scale my Z in the opposite direction. It looks fine in this view, but my scale is actually a negative number, which means that this object is actually flipped inside out. For our purposes right now, that might look fine and it'll render fine, but when we get into texturing objects and lighting objects, that can cause lots of problems. So just make sure that that always stays a positive number, whatever you want. The nice thing about these transform controls is that you can also just type in numbers. So if I want this centered, I could go through a bunch of keyboard shortcuts to center it and it would work and it would be sort of a pain. Or I can just type in 0 in each of these numbers, you just click on them, and it's recentered that object. So it was nudged over a little bit. If I grab it over here, now we can have a more radical change and you can see that. Similarly, if I want to rotate this, let's say I want to rotate it exactly 45 degrees, I can type that number right in here. So if you're building something like a car or something mechanical, being able to type in very precise rotations and locations is important. So if I want this to be exactly 2 blender units wide, a blender unit, by the way, is one of these squares. It doesn't have any bearing on any reality in real world space, but we'll talk about customizing that later on in the semester. And I can make this 1, and I can make this 1, and now I have this nice little cube. All right, so the next video, we're going to get into some more controlled keyboard shortcuts for rotating an object. So being able to use these widgets is really helpful, but going back and forth between widgets is sort of a slow process. You can also shift select these widgets so that you have multiple views at once, but you can see it gets really complicated and it's sort of hard to see what exactly you're working on. So the best method, actually, let me go back to this guy, is to leave it at these transform widgets. Moving things is the thing you tend to do the most. And then in the next video, we're going to get into keyboard shortcuts to controlling these